Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Poland Daily History. We are here at the city of Lublin, one of the most historical and largest cities of all of Eastern Poland. Today, we are going to the Catholic University of Lublin, a bastion of the anti-communist movement during the time when Poland is in the grip of the Soviet Union. It was also the home to Karol Wojtyła, who would later on become Pope John Paul II. There, we will talk to a historian who specializes in 20th century history. As we know, this university that we're at is actually pretty closely tied to the Pope John Paul II. And I was wondering if you can tell us what are his influence on the university and on the culture as general.
Rzeczywiście, Jan Paweł II jest niezwykle mocno związany z tym miejscem, tak bardzo...
Indeed, John Paul II is strongly associated with this place, so strongly in fact that this university today is called the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin, so it's difficult to imagine a closer association than that when a university is actually named after the patron. Before John Paul II became John Paul II, he was a professor at the Catholic University of Lublin. Here, he was known as Professor Karol Wojtyła. He taught classes on philosophy, he was the head of the department and was one of us. So we had a situation where our professor suddenly becomes the head of the Roman Catholic Church and became the first pope who isn't an Italian from time immemorial. It was truly a Copernican revolution. Now we begin to enter a period which I personally remember as a young man. The moment John Paul II was elected as pope was in its own way a miracle. Many people did not believe something like this could happen. John Paul II's first pilgrimage to Poland in 1979 was a signal that started a chain reaction. A year later, in July 1980, the first workers' protest took place here in Lublin for pay rises and against the political course of the communist authorities. A new form of protest was invented here in Lublin. While earlier in 1956, 68 or 1970, I'm mentioning the various waves of protest that went on in Poland, those striking went out onto the streets and protested. Here in Lublin, something new was thought up. We don't go out into the streets, we stay in our workplaces, we hold an occupational strike and wait until the authorities turn up and talk to us. The authorities came to the Lublin workers and signed an agreement. It fulfilled the basic conditions asked for by the workers. Immediately after the Lublin workers had been successful with their strike, workers in other parts of the country saw this, including Lech Wałęsa and Gdańsk, and then the shipyard in that city stood still, and after it, the whole of Poland. In short, the spark which first lit Poland came from Lublin, and I doubt, although perhaps a historian shouldn't say something like this, that something wouldn't have happened, but it's very unlikely that this would have happened if John Paul II had not appeared at a certain point in Polish history. Of course, the Great Carnival of Solidarity was repressed in 1981 because of martial law, and here Lublin once again became a fighting city. Thankfully, this time without any bloody casualties. This is where workplaces went on strike during the 80s, particularly Świdnik. Students from the Catholic University of Lublin and UMCS were also very active. And indeed, the elections of June 4th, 1989 were organized largely by people who are friends of John Paul II, and this history, this great Polish history, this great European history, is beautifully interwoven with the events in Lublin. 1989 in the Lublin Voivodeship symbolizes not only the independence of Poland, but a great victory of ideas, which were co-created somewhere here in Lublin. The idea of the European Union, which many Lublin residents see as a stemming from the Polish-Lithuanian Union, better known as the Union of Lublin.
Współtworzyły ideę Unii Europejskiej, którą wielu z mieszkańców Lublina zakorzenia w Unii Polsko-Litewskiej, w Unii Lubelskiej.
In July 1980, strikes broke out in the city of Świdnik and quickly spread to Lublin. It was the start of the 10 million men strong Solidarity Trade Union, which within a year would frighten the communist regime to such a degree that the communists cracked down on it by declaring martial law. The solidarity movement is pretty prominent here in Lublin, and I was wondering if you can tell us about the more prominent figures that are in the movement.
Myślę, że osobami ikonicznymi dla
I think when it comes to iconic characters in the solidarity movement from Lublin or strongly associated with Lublin, one would definitely be Janusz Krupski. Janusz Krupski studied history here at the university. He began studying in 1969, a year after the events of 1968. He chose this university because he admired the way students were behaving during those events. Before Solidarity was formed, Janusz Krupski began creating an illegal opposition in Lublin. And when we talk about the opposition, an important element, the heart of this opposition, was its publishing activity, publishing underground books. Now, in the era of internet, we have no idea what real censorship actually means. This is when full control of information is in the hands of the authorities. What the opposition could do at the beginning was to break the authorities' exclusive stronghold on information. In 1976, Janusz Krupski was the person to start publishing the first underground works in Poland after the war. In this sense, he was responsible for an enormous breakthrough. In this sense, he began a new era of Polish history. His close cooperator was his friend he had studied with, Bogdan Borusewicz. Bogdan Borusewicz, watching what had happened in Lublin, began organizing a strike in Gdańsk. He is the person who was immediately behind Lech Wałęsa. Some researchers say he came up with Lech Wałęsa as the leader of the workers' strike. Bogdan Borusewicz would play an extremely important role in the underground movement many times, and after Poland regained independence, he was, among others, a Marshal of the Senate. Finally, I would name a now-deceased professor of this university, Jerzy Kłoczowski, who in truth wasn't directly involved in the underground operations of the Solidarity movement, although he did help the movement, but he was an important person who developed certain ideas. The idea of a Europe of two lungs, which meant Europe wasn't just France, Great Britain or Germany, but also had a second lung, which is Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus and Ukraine, was something he constantly reminded people about, and it was he who helped John Paul II and the Polish government in Free Poland to make the eastern part of Europe equally as important in Europe and the world.
Europa stała się równoważną częścią Europy i świata.
Once the communism finally fell, Lublin has went through a transition period from planned economy to one of free market. And I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about the change that happened and how it impacted Lublin's economy as a whole.
Przełom lat 80. i 90. z punktu widzenia historii gospodarczej i społecznej.
The 1980s and 90s, from the point of view of social and economic history, as a period of revolution with all the side effects stemming from such a revolution. The old economic system, which was now completely inefficient, fell. It was no longer able to solve the basic problems and needs of Lublin's residents. It must be remembered where Lublin was, where it is in Poland and Europe. Post-war Lublin is a city at the eastern end of Poland and at the eastern end of Europe. What did this mean? It meant that changes occurred most rapidly in central Poland and the big cities. Lublin and the Lublin Voivodeship, in this sense, was wronged. I personally remember the period when unemployment in Lublin was at 30%. For many people this was a drama, but at the same time it was a drama accompanied with the joy of regaining freedom, a fear of tomorrow, whether it will be possible to buy anything with the money earned. But at the same time, another great change occurred, because at the end of the 80s, it's difficult to imagine now, there was absolutely nothing in the shops. The shelves were completely empty, but the transformation at the beginning of the 90s caused the situation to change completely. Up to this point, we had money, but couldn't really buy anything with it, and from 1989 and 1990, the shelves were now full, but we had no money to buy these goods with. Lublin, as I mentioned, a city with many schools, was practically, until the end of the 20th century, a city with the biggest unemployment rate among students. While cities like Gdańsk, Warsaw and Wrocław picked themselves up from this crisis quicker, Lublin was only really able to enjoy the benefits of the transformation at the beginning of the 21st century, and it's only recently that young people have stopped leaving Lublin.
I dopiero od niedawna młodzi ludzie przestali z Lublina wyjeżdżać.
As we have seen today, Lublin has a very long, yet at times dramatic history. But places such as the Catholic University of Lublin sufficiently demonstrated the city spirit and their love for freedom. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. I'll see you next time on Poland Daily History.